This has been a can of worm that nobody has wanted to take the lid off. We've seen the same problems, we've seen the same issues, and this has been since endoscopy started, and we're talking 30, 40 years ago. Everybody's known the issues related to cross-contamination, patient infections, etc. And that's really what's driven the improvements in the ability to clean and disinfect endoscopes. The disinfection and the sterilization is the easiest part. The most difficult part is having a device that is in a condition to be able to be reprocessed. And that's fundamentally where the problem lays, that we do not know the internal condition of that endoscope.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you are listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you will encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs, with a common goal to help you fight dirty every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we are glad you are here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Nick Bromiley, clinical training specialist with Ambu. Nick has 30 years in healthcare, 20 of that in endoscopy, reprocessing, and infection control with Medivators. He's an ex-anesthesia technician and OR technician, certified Olympus and Fujifilm repair technician, and currently with Ambu as a clinical training specialist for the GI Disposable endoscopy division. Mike, and that technology is emerging, but today we're going to be talking a lot about the differences between Europe and the US when it comes down to reprocessing in terms of standards, what types of infections that they see, and really some of the major differences and also similarities. And Nick's a great guest for that because he spent many years abroad. Actually, that's where he's from. And now he's working in the US. We had a chance to meet him at the Minneapolis conference just a few months back. So it's nice to have him on the show today.
Yeah, I think one of our most repeated quotes that we have on this show came from a guest who's from the EU, Renee Viss, who said that bacteria don't respect borders. And most of the time when we've said that, it's been specific to practices that are in sterile processing or OR-related instances. However, we haven't really talked about flexible endoscope reprocessing and how that plays out in US versus EU standards. So I'm very interested to see how this plays out.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Nick Bromiley, clinical training specialist at Ambu. And Nick, we had a chance to meet briefly at the last live conference that Beyond Clean was able to put on in our partnership with CCI back in the very early days of March in Minneapolis, which I know you call home. Really excited to have you come on the show and talk to us today about a good amount of experience that you've had in the industry, which is flexible scopes and the differences between US and UK or EU standards. So thanks for coming on.
Pleasure to meet you guys.
Now, let's talk about some of the major differences. We've had a few shows like this in the past where we've talked about different standards. And, I think parametric release was one of those topics that we got into in the past. But this is going to be different because we're going to be focusing mostly on the GI world. So let's maybe start with having you tell us about some of your experience and what kind of sets the table for the background and why you have the experience to tell us about the differences between UK or EU and the United States.
So my background really started in the UK with an introduction to the healthcare environment as an anesthesia technician. And then following that as an OR tech, it led me into one of the first dedicated GI suites that was formed in the UK. And this is before the days of submersible endoscopes. So we were still only reprocessing the insertion tube of the scope. because the fact of the design of the scope wouldn't allow us to do anything else. So that's really where my passion for GI reprocessing started. I then worked for a little while for Olympus. I did some work with Fujifilm as well, and became a factory-trained technician for both those companies. So I know the ins and outs of the scopes to a very great extent. I then worked for a company called ESL, who became the first distributorship for endoscope reprocessors in the UK. The reprocessing company was called Medivators, and it was based here in Minnesota, and very quickly got involved in the automated endoscope reprocessing business. The transition really to the US was that the UK and the European market was perhaps 2 to 2.5 years ahead of the US market. And Medivators asked me to move over to the US and provide some international expertise on endoscope reprocessor design. So that's basically why I'm here.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to diving into it. And I want to start maybe a little more high level, but what are the major differences between EU and US standards around GI and reprocessing?
So I think right off the bat, the biggest difference is the FDA. The FDA obviously influences everything that goes on here in the US, but outside of the US, it bears no relevance at all. Some countries are a little bit more interested than others, but basically FDA 510K approval for medical devices is meaningless anywhere else in the world. Canada takes some notice of following FDA recommendations, but that's about it. So the issue with Europe basically is that the UK started the whole process of regulations for endoscope reprocessing and endoscope reprocessor design with the publication of HTM 2030. HTM stands for Health Technical Memorandum, and that was published in 1995. And really that became the basis for the following standard, which is the ISO standard 15883, which now is embodied for the whole of Europe on endoscope designs. Every country in Europe has an input into these standards. So consequently, you end up with a multitude of different requirements depending on the country that you're actually in. And that's the major difference between Europe and the US, whereas you have one regulatory body, which is the FDA.
So that's really interesting. And like Justin said, we've talked to a number of guests who are coming from the EU, and it does seem like there is a pretty significant difference in just the way that the standards themselves are developed. And so you've already mentioned that the FDA is a pretty major differentiator there, especially with the 510K forms that are required for market submission. And, you know, I think kind of the golden rule outside of the FDA is probably the, AAMI standards. And so walk me through how are standards developed in the EU then?
With great difficulty. The problem with Europe is that although you have the overriding standard, 15883, and this is the regulation that everybody must design and build automated endoscope reprocessors to, each of the countries that participate in the ISO standards have their own annex with respect to the original standard. So if I, as an individual, built an endoscope reprocessor in the UK and I followed the UK recommendation for the design, I actually couldn't sell that machine to anybody in France because they have a different requirement. Same if I built it in France and tried to sell it into Germany, they would have a different requirement. And so you end up with these multitudes of different design requirements, even though they're all following the same standard. And it becomes incredibly difficult for a manufacturer outside of Europe to understand the regulations and actually meet those requirements. And just for example, if we talk about soil that are used to test the efficacy of cleaning, we have 5 different soils in Europe, UK, Germany, Netherlands, France, and Austria. And every one of these countries requires a different level of soil and different ingredients to make up that soil that your AER has to clean. So it's almost impossible to design a machine that's going to work everywhere in Europe.
So I feel like the general consensus, I'm coming at this from the standpoint of obviously the US because that's where I've lived. And it seems like very frequently we look over at the EU like they're ahead of us. And yet, as you're describing this sounds like a slower moving bureaucracy with so many different competing voices. Whereas in the US, you have one voice that seems to matter more than any others. So what's the perception from the EU side? Do they see themselves as behind or ahead, or how do they perceive that on that side?
I think that's a very true perspective that you have. The problem is with American companies who are trying to export medical devices into Europe. It takes them such a long time to get through the FDA approval. So if you follow the design process, let's say year one, you come up with a concept for a medical device. Let's say it's an AER. You take 2 years to develop it. You take another year to submit it to the FDA. You take another year for the approval. That's 4 years. Europe is about 2 years ahead of where the US is in terms of their requirement. So by the time that you get this device ready to sell into Europe, it's 2 to 3 years obsolescent before it even gets there. The other difficulty is that even if you do get a US-based device into Europe, getting the Americans to make any changes or modifications to that equipment to fulfill the local requirements is absolutely impossible. And that's due to the fact that once you have the FDA approval, it's very difficult to make any changes.
So they would almost have to put out a completely new design to be able to have that flexibility.
Yes. I think basically there is another way around this, is that if you're going to be a US company, you need to design and build devices outside of the FDA requirement, primarily for Europe, and keep the FDA requirements for your home market and, where you've got your finger on the pulse. For most companies, one of the answers to that problem has been to actually acquire manufacturing organizations in the country of your choice that actually have a sales force and they have an approved piece of equipment that you can sell directly into that market. That's another way around the problem.
Oh, yeah. There's always a loophole, right? There's always a way. So that's neat. All right. So let's talk a little bit about outbreaks now. We're going to shift the conversation from standards a little bit and move into the fact that Americans, we'll just say that, Americans are more familiar with outbreaks that are associated with duodenoscopes and VRE. But I guess what we want to know is, have there been different outbreaks in the EU than there have been in the US? Are you seeing the same issues? Like, how's that playing out?
No, I think that the anatomy of human beings is the same globally. The endoscopes are the same globally. The reprocessing requirements are the same globally. And the issues are the same globally. So to answer your question, no, we've seen, I say I'm here in the US, I'm not in Europe anymore. But I know that Europe has seen the same issues as we've seen here in the US.
So what do you think is, if the issues are the same and the devices are similar, but the standards are different, like, what is the big difference between the two in terms of what justifies the standards if the issues are the same, et cetera? Do you see what I mean? Like, if the science is the same and the issues are the same, then why are the standards different, I guess, is the best way to ask that.
I have no clue at all. I think a lot of it has to do with ego. I think that you'll find that each of these countries have their own opinion on what is best practice and what should be done for the good of the patient. And that differs depending on who you talk to. I mean, we know here in the US that we have umpteen different experts, all who have an opinion on the best way to reprocess endoscopes or on the infection prevention side of things. And they all have a different opinion. Unfortunately, in Europe, each of those different opinions comes from a different country that has a voice in how the whole regulatory structure is put together. And I think that's where the problem is.
Interesting. So, like, one of the big debates, as you know, in the U.S. is about whether or not to sterilize scopes versus doing high-level disinfection like we've seen in the past, except then we're having these issues. And so there's a big conversation around that. And there's a very common and accurate statement that everybody makes in reprocessing reprocessing. If it's not clean, it can't be sterile. But at the same time, when you talk about the FDA, it really shouldn't be able to hit the market unless it can be effectively cleaned. And that's why we see anytime there is an issue, there's a lot of liability that is dancing around the concept of instructions for use. Did you follow the instructions for use? How does that play out in the EU in a similar setting?
I don't think there's any differences between wherever globally you're reprocessing an endoscope. You still have the IFUs, you still have the local regulations, you still have society guidelines to follow. And I think everybody follows them to the best of their ability. Certainly nobody gets up in the morning saying, I'm going to kill 2 or 3 patients today just because I feel like, not cleaning an endoscope properly. That's certainly not the attitude. I think in reality, the whole of the system is flawed. The cards are stacked against successful reprocessing, and irrespective of how much you adhere to, you follow your meticulous cleaning, every step is done in the correct order at the correct time, and it's all recorded. If the odds are stacked against you to be successful, then it's never going to work. And as for the regulatory position of, well, let's sterilize them. If you can't clean them to disinfect them, you can't clean them to sterilize them. To put it bluntly, a polished turd is still a turd.
I guarantee you that's the first time that's been used on this podcast. That's great.
I love it. It's true, though. And, Mike, you'll probably want to jump in on this part of the conversation. But, to us, too, it has a lot to do with where are the resources being placed. And I would bet that also has something to do with the differences in the United States from the EU. Is just follow the money trail, right? Who's developing what products? What seat do they have in helping guide and inform regulation? And that, I think, probably has a little bit to do with it. I think we could all agree on that. But at the same time, when we talk about resources on this show, we're typically talking about resources in terms of technology advancements. We're talking about training. We're talking about education, which is almost the same as training, but not quite. And we're talking about pay scale. And that we feel like if we invest into those areas, then maybe these things will go away. What's your hunch on that?
Wow, that's a big question. I think fundamentally the problem is here that if you speak to anybody who understands endoscope reprocessing, and I mean really understands it, not just on the surface, this has been a can of worms that nobody has wanted to take the lid off. We've seen the same problems, we've seen the same issues, and this has been since endoscopy started, and we're talking 30, 40 years ago. Everybody's known the issues related to cross-contamination, patient infections, etc., etc., and that's really what's driven the improvements in the ability to clean and disinfect endoscopes. The disinfection and the sterilization is the easiest part. The most difficult part is having a device that is in a condition to be able to be reprocessed. And that's fundamentally where the problem lays, that we do not know the internal condition of that endoscope. And I've spoken to people before who have said that a brand new reusable endoscope can be damaged to the extent that it can't be cleaned or disinfected after one procedure. So if we take that as the basis for the successful reprocessing of reusable scopes, that means that after every single first procedure, that scope should be suspiciously looked at from the point of view that, has it been damaged? I mean, when you look at some of the accessories that are used down these devices, especially when we look at duodenoscopy or ERCP, there's some pretty torturous use of the endoscope there with the accessories. And it's easy to see that biopsy forceps, stents, guide wires, sphincterotomes, any of those types of devices can actually damage the internal channels of the scope to the extent that organisms are going to hide in there, and you can brush to your heart's content and it's not going to get it out.
What you're saying is so critical because as you're talking, I'm thinking about a research study that was done by Corey Ofsted's group in which, and it was just a survey of, what the experience of cleaning an endoscope is like. And probably the piece that jumped out to me the most in that whole study was that over 70% of reprocessing technicians feel pressure to rush when it comes to reprocessing flexible endoscopes. And we've talked about with multiple guests before what that pressure and stress does to the error rate whenever it comes up to, how frequently you're going to make errors in a reprocessing cycle. And if you add stress into that mix, that error rate goes up significantly. And then like you're saying, there could be pieces that go into this that make it essentially uncleanable in the first place. So you've got stress, you've got pressure to rush, and you've got pieces that really are just completely out of the control of the reprocessing technicians. And I really feel like to a certain degree, we almost need to tell reprocessing technicians that these failures, they're not exactly your fault a lot of the time. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think fundamentally the biggest problem is that right off the bat, you've got the lowest paid hourly workers who have the least amount of training. They don't know and they don't understand and they don't realize the consequences of their actions. They don't know the difference from one scope to another scope, the nuances, the different types of channels, the order in which all these steps have to be conducted in. And I think that if you went into any GI suite today and you actually laid it on the line with some of these technicians that they are liable for the condition of that scope that's used on the next patient, you would scare them beyond belief, because I don't think they understand that.
Okay. Yep. We could talk about this probably on 5 more episodes. I mean, whenever you're getting at the heart or fundamental flaws and issues with systems, we can just go all over the place with this. But here's something. Let's talk about how they want to address this, because the main topics right now are around sterilizing scopes, which is where I was going with, if it's not clean, it can't be sterile. But I want to go into that conversation, but in this setting of comparing and contrasting the US with going over the pond to Europe. Is there an effort in Europe at the same time that we're seeing it in the US to say maybe we should be sterilizing these scopes?
So I think that there's several aspects to that question. One is, do we actually need sterilization? And the short answer is no, we don't. If you can clean the scopes correctly, we know that high-level disinfection absolutely kills all of the organisms that we're concerned about. Maybe there's a few spores that will slip through a high-level disinfection process, but in normal reprocessing terms, we're not too concerned about spores. I think that the problem here is that everybody is assuming that the term sterilization means that there is no better standard of reprocessing. When you mention sterile, that's a defined standard. I think people tend to forget that the steps leading up to a sterile device are exactly the same as the steps leading up to a high-level disinfected device. And I mean, if you look at the FDA and bless their cotton socks, they're stumbling for an answer to this problem. They've come out with back-to-back disinfection cycles. Well, if you haven't killed it the first time, what makes you think you're going to kill it the second time? They'd have been far better off recommending back-to-back cleaning cycles, which is where the problem actually is. And then they're talking about, using alternative technologies and sterilizing where possible. So, you take your duodenoscope, you use it, you send it off. The only real method of sterilizing today is ETO. Your scope's gone for 18 to 24 hours. I mean, that's just not practical for an ERCP list. A lot of the market is switching to disposable components for the endoscope. And one of the sayings that I always use is that your level of decontamination is only as good as the weakest link in the chain. So if you've gone through all these steps to properly clean and disinfect your endoscope, and then you're going to stick a dirty valve in it, or you're going to stick a piece of dirty tubing connected to one aspect of the scope or not, then your level of reprocessing is reduced to the standard of the device you just used on it. So if people are so bent out of shape about using disposable components, why not go for disposable scopes and fix the problem completely?
Well, you read our minds. That's exactly where we were going. One option is to status quo, focus on cleaning. Another option was to sterilize. And I really like the point that you made about sterilizing it twice doesn't solve the problem. If you were going to do one of the steps in the reprocessing a second time, you should do manual cleaning again, or even automated. But you should do the cleaning process twice. But the third option that has been emerging, and I think one of the biggest challenges to single-use devices has really been the the cost to it more than anything. And then I would say probably secondary, although still important, would be like the green factor. So can you talk about how that's all playing out as this single-use market for flexible scopes? I know bronchoscopes have been out for a little while, but the development to just continue growing that market, there's an investment being made and it's gaining some traction. So how do they reconcile the finances and the green aspects?
I think you're completely missing the mark here. This has been a topic of discussion with Ambu, who I'm currently working for, and their approach has been to convert physicians to single-use devices. And I think for too long, the physician has been the person that ultimately has the final decision on whether a device will be used or not. And I think the problem when you're talking about single use is that it is a disruptive technology. It's a completely different platform, and you can't compare single-use flexible endoscopes to existing models of reusable endoscopes. And I think that the crux of the matter here is that as long as the device is patient safe, it can conduct the procedure that it's designed to do, then I think you need to tend to put physicians' preferences on the back burner. Because at the end of the day, this is about infection prevention. This is not about physicians' preferences on color or whether it's got aluminum wheels or, whether it's got a blower under the hood or whatever it is. This comes down to what is safest for the patient. And I think that's the way that single use needs to be led. I think we need to demonstrate that every single endoscopic procedure has the risk of a patient infection. And whether it's from the devices that are used down it, whether it's down to poor reprocessing, whether it's down to the procedure, at the end of the day, you cannot guarantee that a reusable device is effectively reprocessed and patient safe. And that's the one thing that you can do with the disposable scope.
Now, Nick, I'm coming at this from the perspective of a sterile processing technician because that's my background. And very frequently, anytime somebody came to my department and said, hey, we're going to take this device out of your hands and we're going to move to single use or disposable, I would almost take it personally because the idea is that, you're saying I'm not good enough at my job. So how do you kind of address those technicians and say, listen, this is not about your abilities necessarily?
So I have the greatest respect for the people in the healthcare setting who are hidden behind the curtains, and they're doing a phenomenal job day in, day out, without the recognition that they justly deserve. The problem with GI reprocessing is that the cards are stacked against you from the start. And it doesn't matter whether you follow every single step of the IFUs to perfection, whether you record all the steps that you've done. And let's face it, if it's not recorded, it never happened. And there are so many steps to reprocessing a scope successfully. And the one thing that you don't have any control over is the condition of the scope. So, as I said earlier, if a scope is damaged after the first procedure, every subsequent reprocessing cycle is potentially flawed. And, these people just don't understand that they don't have a chance of succeeding at all, not with the current methods of reprocessing. And it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, how much training you give the reprocessing techs, how many more cleaning brushes you have or AERs you have. If the scope is damaged, the scope is damaged. And basically you're screwed.
Nick, I got to tell you, this is a great interview. I have a feeling that we're going to be having you on a future episode again in another season. Really glad you reached out to me to talk about the opportunity to speak on the show. And I'm really, really happy that we did this. And I think that many of the technicians will gain a new perspective out there around reprocessing and the challenges. So thank you very much for coming on.
You are absolutely more than welcome. And if you'd like to do something else in the future, please reach out.
That was Nick Bromiley, clinical training specialist at Ambu. And Mike, what an interesting episode. I know we've talked a lot about reprocessing, and when you talk about complex medical devices, you're always talking about flexible scopes, and flexible scopes has been in the news. It was the number one talked about infection situation until recently, but it's not going away. It's still there. And Nick really brought a unique perspective between Europe and the US, although outside of standards and guidelines, not a lot of differences there.
Yeah, and I was really interested to hear his perspective on this, on US versus EU standards, because, like you said, this has been one of the biggest areas of focus for the US, and yet I kind of feel like not much has changed. So I really wanted to hear what was going on the other side as well.
Yeah, and really his perspectives on the role of sterile processing and GI technicians that are reprocessing these instruments and just the position that they're in. It was a breath of fresh air to hear somebody say that in such an eloquent way.
Yeah, and that really is a critical piece that we needed to hear said from an expert, was that, we can't simply just do it better in some cases. This really is a situation where the cards are stacked against the reprocessing technicians, and it really may not be their fault that, some of these devices aren't getting clean. Now, that may not be the case in every situation, but there are plenty, I think, where the reprocessing technicians really are doing their best, and it's still just isn't working out, and they need to be told this isn't your fault.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Mike and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.